Okay, here's some of the basic tools you're going to need for the job, or what I use in my workshop. You've got soldering station with the soldering iron holder, sponge, solder tip cleaner, some flux. This tool is pretty important. Solder, I should say desolder sucker type deal. $10 at Radio Shack. Fume extractor, very important for your safety. Soldering spool, a little bottle of rubbing alcohol. X-Acto knife, or Pro Edge is the name of that one. Some tip tinner, that's just more cleaning product. Some solder wick, also aids in solder removal. Homemade wire spool here for the 30 gauge wire that I use. Of course, digital multimeter. Q-tips. Some miscellaneous wire strippers, cutters. Electrical tape there in the middle. Anyway, let's get started. This is how to replace the thumbstick mechanism on an Xbox 360 controller. You're going to need that at minimum a soldering iron and that solder desucker tool you just saw there with the red ball. You can get both of those at Radio Shack. And of course, you're either going to need replacement parts or a donor circuit board. So right here I've got a circuit board that is bad. Then I'm going to take the thumbstick mechanism off. And unfortunately, to get to the thumbstick mechanism, you really have to remove the triggers first. So there's 3 solder points. That's all that needs to be desoldered to get the trigger off. So we're going to use our sucker here. You've got to heat it. It takes about 10 minutes to heat up. You squeeze the ball, put that over it, kind of try to move the tool around a little bit to try to get that solder flowing, and then you release that red ball and it sucks the solder up into it. And you'll need to spit that solder out each time into like a tin cup, or like my solder holder stand has a little metal cup. It's something that can hold hot solder because it's going to come shooting out like hot solder. So just the same thing there. Oh, by the way, I didn't have breakfast this morning, so I got a real bad case of the shakes in this video. But yeah, you're just trying to suck most of the solder off. There may be a little bit there trying to keep those pins from being totally free. And so what I'm trying to do here is use my soldering iron to make sure those pins are loose before I try to pull the trigger mechanism out. If the pins are not loose, yeah, I did a bad job there, so I'm taking a second pass with that tool. Yeah, you got to make sure those pins are loose. If those pins are not completely desoldered and loose, when you try to pull that trigger mechanism out, you're going to rip the solder pads with it and damage your board irreparably. So sometimes those pins will get loose right away. Sometimes you have to apply a little heat. Right there I'm putting flux. Flux is your best friend. It's going to help solder flow better if you seem to, for lack of a better term, the solder connections seem to dry up, I guess. So you put a little bit of this on there and that solder is going to flow better. So here I am again. You can see that the pin's moving there now. Those pins are getting loose. So you can see you kind of tap it with the soldering iron and it's probably ready to go ahead and pull them through. You're just going to have to keep working with it until you get those pins loose, because like I said, if you try to yank that, you're going to damage the circuit board. So Q-tips, rubbing alcohol works fine. On this type of flux, I happen to be using a no-clean lead-free flux, and what the experts tell you is rubbing alcohol is just fine. If you are not using lead-free, no-clean flux, you should probably double-check on what kind of cleaning solvent you're going to want to use. Just good housekeeping to clean that stuff up. And we'll play around with it a little bit. There's a little white clip there hanging onto the board I'm pointing at with my tweezers. You kind of have to pop that off. I ended up having to grab a screwdriver to get this thing to pop off. That's pretty much what's holding the trigger on at this point, since we've already desoldered the 3 metal connections there. So you'll see in the video in a minute how to pop that off. Again, the reason we're removing that trigger is that's the only way to access the soldering points to get that trigger mechanism desoldered. So if you have a bad trigger and you just want to replace the trigger mechanism, this is how you do it. It's actually a lot easier than replacing the whole thumbstick. There you go. And you might just gently wiggle a little bit when you're pulling the trigger off, this is to make sure that you see the pins are loose there. You don't want to just yank it again. You want to just kind of tug at it a little bit and make sure you did get those pins desoldered all the way. So there's your trigger mechanism right there. That's what it looks like. Pretty simple. So if you were replacing a trigger mechanism, you know how to do that now. And all these points, unfortunately, are all of the points that are holding that trigger mechanism on. So we've got to desolder all of those. So it's just the same thing. You got to go around with the tool on each one of those points. Again, I didn't have breakfast this morning, so I got a real bad case of the shakes. Plus, this is not easy trying to do this with the for the camera. The better that you do with this tool, the easier it will be to get those pins free. If you want to be sure to hold the tool down long enough and kind of move it around on the connection point to suck off as much solder as you can. That way you don't have to spend so much time poking at it with your soldering iron later trying to make sure those pins are loose. One thing I didn't do here that you probably could, you could put a little bit of flux on there first. With the flux, I guess the main reason I don't is I use this tool quite a bit, and the flux may have the tendency to plug up your nozzle, which is no big deal. I think the nozzles are, $3 for $5 or something. Radio Shack, if you can get them, replacement nozzles for this tool. This desoldering tool is pretty much I won't say the cheapest, but one of the cheapest tools I've got, and definitely worth the money. I think it's literally like $15 now at Radio Shack. Works great. No need to buy a $1,000 desoldering tool for what we're doing here. Notice I left those 4 solder points there for that. That's for the right bumper. You don't want to remove those. And again, taking the soldering iron, just kind of poking at those pins, trying to check that they're free. Got one there, it's a little sticky out where you see it move. The reason those pins get stuck is basically the desoldering tool didn't get all the solder. So, got some sticky pins down there at the bottom. I'm going to use the flux again. Sometimes you don't necessarily need to desolder it. If you just flex it and put your hot iron on it, the solder is going to pool around. It's going to come off the pins and go onto those pads. So that might be enough to get the pins loose. Just something you have to play with. The soldering wick, if you're familiar with what that is another item that would help get that solder off those pads. You could use the wick instead of this desoldering tool. May actually turn out to be easier. I'm just, again, gently tugging at it. Feels like all the pins are loose. Again, just verify there, take a good look to make sure you're not ripping any pads off. That part just comes right out. And there is our good thumbstick out of our donor circuit board. And now we have to go repeat the process on the circuit board that we're replacing the thumbstick mechanism on. So you can see that, it's just there's a close-up view of what your thumbstick really is.